The boy who dared look. Everyone in Ardenmill feared the sounds behind the old academy shed. Low, trembling whimpers rattled the tin roof every night without explanation. No one dared look, except a 12-year-old boy named Callum Bryce. The sounds had started 3 weeks ago, arriving without warning the way strange things often do, quietly at first, easy to dismiss, until they weren't. The teachers had theories. Pipes, most of them said, with the confident tone people use when they haven't actually checked. The older students preferred something more dramatic, a trapped spirit, a cursed relic, the restless echo of something that had died badly on academy grounds long ago. These theories spread the way good rumors always do, a gathering detail and weight with every retelling, until the shed had become something nobody walked past after sundown without picking up their pace. The groundskeeper, a weathered man named Orrin who had worked the academy grounds for 30 years, said nothing at all. He simply redirected anyone who wandered too close, hammered an extra plank across the shed's side window one Tuesday morning, and went about his work with the tight expression of someone sitting on a secret they hadn't decided whether to share yet. His silence somehow was the most unsettling thing of all. Callum had noticed all of this. He was the sort of boy who noticed things. Not because he was particularly brave or particularly reckless, but because he paid attention in a world that mostly rewarded people for looking away. And he sat third from the window in his afternoon class, and on still days, when the courtyard fell quiet between lessons, he could hear it faintly through the glass. Not pipes. He knew what pipes sounded like. This was something that ached, something that had a texture to it. Desperate and low and tired. The sound of a creature that had been afraid for so long it had almost forgotten what safety felt like. His classmates pulled their koi. The thing behind the wall. Callum followed the sound of something sad the way others followed excitement. Behind the shed, pressed against the stone wall, was a small dragon hatchling. Her scales were ash gray, her eyes swollen shut, and a rope burned raw around her neck. He had expected many things during the walk across the courtyard, a stray animal, perhaps, a bird with a broken wing wedged under the rotting boards. Even, in the wilder corner of his imagination, something stranger. Ardenmill was an old town, and old towns had a habit of hiding peculiar things in ordinary places. But he had not expected this. Nothing in 12 years of living had prepared him for the sight of a dragon hatchling folded into that narrow gap between the shed wall and the stone fence. A small and broken and trembling so hard he could see it from 6 feet away. She was young. That much was obvious even to someone who had never seen a dragon up close. Her horns were still soft at the tips, barely curved, the kind that hadn't yet decided what shape they intended to become. Her wings, far too large for her body, were folded in on themselves like crumpled paper someone had tried and failed to smooth back out. They twitched occasionally at the edges, not with aggression, but with the involuntary anxiety of a creature that had been tense for so long, the tension had become habit. Her scales should have been beautiful. Callum could see that even through the damage. Beneath the grime and the dried blood and the dull flatness that came from poor condition, there was a depth to the gray, like cooling embers still holding their heat somewhere underneath. But the swollen eye pulled his attention and held it. Shut completely on the left side, the skin around it dark and puffy, the kind of injury that didn't happen by accident, and the rope, coarse, thick, the kind used for hauling cargo, had been looped twice around her neck and knotted without care, wearing the scales beneath it too. She trembled the moment she saw him, a cry building deep in her chest. Every instinct she owned had learned that humans meant pain. But Callum simply crouched down, rested his chin on his arms, and smiled. The sound that rose in her throat was not quite a growl and not quite a wail. It lived somewhere between the two, caught in that desperate middle place where fear and warning become the same thing. her one good eye fixed on him with an intensity that was almost unbearable to hold, amber and wide and full of a terrible anticipation. She was waiting for what came next. She already knew what came next. Her whole body said so, the way she pressed harder into the stone wall, the way her wings pulled tighter against her sides, and the way her claws scraped shallow grooves into the dirt beneath her without her seeming to notice she was doing it. She had learned her lessons well, and every single one of them had taught her the same thing. Callum saw all of this. He saw it the way he saw most things, clearly, and without looking away from the uncomfortable parts. He understood that she was not threatening him. He understood that the sound in her chest and the tension in her body were not anger, but armor, the only kind she had left after whatever had been done to her. And he understood, with a certainty he couldn't have explained to anyone who asked, that the worst thing he could possibly do right now was move quickly, or speak loudly, or try to close the distance between them before she had decided, on her own terms, and in her own time, that he was something different from what she'd known before. So he didn't. He crouched at the edge of the gap, folded his arms across his knees, rested his chin on top of them, and smiled at her. Not a wide smile, not a performed one. Just the small, natural expression that came to his face when he encountered something he found genuinely worth his attention, easy and unhurried, and asking abs. The language of staying. It was not a clever smile or a cautious one. It carried nothing behind it. He didn't reach, didn't speak, didn't ask her for a single thing. He just stayed, quiet and unhurried, as though he had nowhere else to be. This, more than anything, confused her. She had encountered patience before, but it had always been the patient of a trap. The kind that went still and waited precisely because it wanted something, because stillness was just another strategy, another way of getting close enough. She knew that kind of quiet. It had a texture to it, a coiled tension underneath the surface that she had learned to read the way other creatures read the wind. It always ended the same way, and she had the rope around her neck and the swollen eye to show for every time she had misread it. But this was different, and the difference unsettled her more than familiarity would have. Callum's stillness had no coil to it, no underneath. He was simply there, a boy sitting in the mud at the edge of her gap with his chin on his arms, occasionally blinking, occasionally shifting his weight slightly when his knees protested the position, making no effort whatsoever to disguise the small human discomforts of holding still for a long time. That, somehow, was the strangest part. He wasn't performing patience. He was just genuinely, unremarkably present, the way a tree was present or a stone was present, not because it wanted something from the space it occupied, but simply because that was where it was. The lunch bell rang distantly across the courtyard. He didn't move. Voices drifted from the other side of the shed. Other students, other concerns. A world that was carrying on without him and apparently doing fine. He gave it no attention. His eyes stayed on her, but softly, the way someone watches a fire rather than the way someone watches a door they're waiting to open. She tested him in the small ways frightened creatures test things. She shiff. After a long while, the hatchling stretched her neck forward and sniffed his shoe. Callum reached slowly into his pocket and set a bread roll between them. She stared at it, stared at him, then swallowed it whole and looked at him differently. The stretching of her neck had cost her something. He understood that without being told. It was not a casual movement. It was a decision, made slowly and at great personal risk by a creature whose every previous decision to move toward a human had ended badly. She extended herself by inches, pausing between each one to reassess, her nostrils working steadily as she processed the information the air carried about him. Mud. Wool from his coat, ink from the morning's lessons. Nothing sharp, nothing chemical, nothing that matched the catalog of warnings her memory had spent weeks compiling. Just a boy, sitting in mud, smelling remarkably ordinary. When she reached his shoe, she stopped and sniffed it with the focused seriousness of someone reading an important document, and Callum held himself so still he forgot to breathe for a moment. He was aware, distantly, that a dragon hatchling's jaw was close enough to his foot to cause significant damage if she chose. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this did not particularly frighten him. She wasn't going to. He didn't know how he knew that, but he did. He reached into his coat pocket with a slowness that was almost ceremonial. No sudden angles, no sharp movements, nothing that would shatter the fragile and extraordinary thing currently happening in the mud behind the academy shed. His fingers found the bread roll he'd been saving since breakfast. A slightly squashed and very ordinary, and he brought it out and set it on the ground exactly halfway between them, then pulled his hand back to where it had been. She stared at the bread roll for a long time. Then she stared at him. One amber eye, still wide, but carrying something new in. The village had thoughts. By Wednesday, half the village had heard what the Bryce boy had done. By Thursday, the other half had added details that hadn't happened yet. The headmaster sent a letter, the neighbors sent opinions, and nobody sent help. This was, Callum had come to understand, how Ardenmill worked. It was not a cruel village exactly. It was simply a cautious one, the kind of place that had existed long enough to develop strong opinions about the correct way things ought to be done, and a deep suspicion of anyone who did them differently. It had a rhythm to it, a comfortable and well-worn groove of behavior that most of its residents followed without thinking, the way water follows the path carved for it by years of running the same direction. Deviation was noted. Deviation involving a dragon was noted loudly, repeatedly, and with considerable creative embellishment. By Wednesday morning, the story had already shed several of its more boring, accurate details in favor of more interesting, inaccurate ones. The bread roll became a full meal. The shed became a lair. The hatchling, who had done nothing more alarming than sniff a shoe and eat some bread, had in certain retellings already breathed fire at the groundskeeper, bitten through the academy fence, and driven off 3 older students who had never, in fact, been anywhere near the shed. Facts, in Ardenmill, were considered more of a starting point than a destination. The headmaster's letter arrived at the Bryce household on Wednesday evening, written in the careful formal language of someone who wanted to express serious concern without technically committing to any specific claim. It referenced the Academy's duty of care, the safety of its students, and the importance of responsible conduct in measured tones that somehow managed to feel both urgent and vague at the same time. Callum's mother read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and looked at her son with an expression that conveyed the girl who burned with embarrassment. Callum had quietly named her Ember because she sneezed small jets of orange flame when startled. She always looked embarrassed about it afterward, glancing away as if it hadn't happened. He never laughed, which she seemed to appreciate more than anything else. The name had come to him on the 3rd day, naturally and without ceremony, the way the right names always do. Not chosen so much as recognized, as though it had always belonged to her and he had simply been the one to notice it. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't written it down or told anyone. He had simply started using it quietly in his own mind while he sat with her, and then one afternoon it had slipped out under his breath without thinking, soft and offhand. And she had lifted her head and looked at him with an attention so sudden and complete that he was fairly certain she had heard it and understood that it was hers. She had looked away immediately after with great dignity. He had smiled and said nothing, which was becoming something of a pattern between them. The sneezing had started on the 4th day. A sparrow had landed on the fence post directly beside her without warning, and Ember had startled so hard her whole body jerked, and a short, sharp jet of orange flame had shot from her nostrils, with a sound like a struck match amplified considerably. The sparrow departed at significant speed. Ember sat very still in the aftermath, staring straight ahead at the middle distance with an expression of absolute composure, and as though reviewing whether there was any version of events in which that had not just happened. There wasn't, objectively. The scorch mark on the fence post was quite clear. Callum had pressed his lips together and looked very carefully at the ground and thought about arithmetic until the urge to laugh had passed completely. It took longer than he would have liked to admit, but he held it, and when he looked back up, his face was the weight that finally fell. On the 5th day, Callum cut the rope from her neck without drama or delay. She hadn't flinched once, her amber eye watching him with careful, fragile trust. When it fell away, she stood up straighter, like something remembering it was allowed to exist. He had brought the small knife from home that morning, tucked into his coat pocket alongside the usual bread. He hadn't told anyone he was bringing it. He hadn't made a plan around it or rehearsed what he would do. He had simply looked at the rope the previous evening on his walk home, turning the image of it over in his mind the way he turned difficult problems over, quietly, persistently, from different angles, and arrived at the uncomplicated conclusion that it needed to come off and that he was the one who was going to do it. And that tomorrow was not too soon. The rope had been bothering him since the first moment he'd seen it, not just because of the damage it had done, the raw patches beneath it, the way she held her neck with a slight stiffness that spoke of constant low-grade pain, but because of what it meant. Someone had put it there deliberately. Someone had looked at this creature and decided that binding her was the appropriate response to her existence, and had done so without care or precision, knotting it tight and walking away. The rope was not the whole of what had been done to her, but it was the most visible part, and every day it remained, it said the same thing to her in a language she understood deeply and Callum found completely unacceptable, that she was meant to stay small, that she was meant to be held, that whoever had put it there had the right to define the boundaries of what she was allowed to be. He approached her that morning the way he always did, slowly, without drama, giving her time to read his intentions in the unhurried quality of his movement. He sat beside her in their usual way first, letting the ordinary rhythm of their Tim, the boy who stood, and said, "So the village council met and declared Ember dangerous and in need of removal." Callum stood before them and said that frightened and dangerous were two different things. His mother covered her eyes briefly, but did not stop him from finishing. The council met on Friday evenings in the old hall beside the mill, around a table that had held the same 5 chairs for longer than anyone currently sitting in them had been alive. It was a table that had seen boundary disputes and water rights, and the great argument of 1887 over where exactly the market should be permitted to set up on Saturdays. It was accustomed to gravity. It was accustomed to the particular atmosphere of people who had decided something before they arrived and were now performing the formality of deciding it in public. The councilman heard opened by reading aloud from 3 written complaints, 2 of which described Ember in terms that bore no meaningful resemblance to the creature Callum had been sitting with every morning for 5 days. The 3rd complaint was from Master Fenwick, who had written with academic precision that dragons were categorically unpredictable and cited 2 historical texts that were, Callum noted privately, several centuries out of date and written by people who had never been within 100 miles of an actual dragon. The council listened to the complaints with solemn nods. They consulted briefly among themselves in lowered voices. Councilwoman Aldrich referenced the apple cart that Ember had allegedly knocked over, though nobody in the room had witnessed this directly, and the cart's owner had not, in fact, submitted a complaint. None of this appeared to slow the momentum of the proceedings. Their conclusion, when it came, was delivered with the satisfied finality of people who had done their due diligence. Ember was a danger to the community, and arrangements would be made for her removal within the fortnight. Callum's mother reached for. She had waited. The council allowed Ember to stay under the Bryce family's responsibility, unhappily. Callum thanked them and walked back to the academy without hurrying. Ember was at the fence, perfectly still, having not moved once the entire time he was gone. The unhappiness of the council was evident in the way the compromise was delivered, clipped and formal, with the tight economy of people conceding a point they intended to revisit at the earliest available opportunity. Councilman Hurd had added 3 conditions that hadn't been discussed, apparently improvised in the moment, which Callum's mother had written down without expression and folded into her coat pocket. There would be monthly reviews. There would be boundaries established around Ember's permitted movements on academy grounds. There would be, Councilwoman Aldrich added with pointed emphasis, accountability for any further incidents involving property. Callum had thanked them with the same even courtesy he'd used throughout, which he could tell bothered them slightly, and then walked out of the old hall into the cool evening air with his mother beside him. She was quiet for the first part of the walk. This was not unusual. His mother was a woman who processed things in the order they deserved rather than the order they arrived, and Friday evenings after council meetings apparently required a particular kind of processing that benefited from silence and fresh air. After a while, she said, without looking at him, that he had made several good points in there. He said thank you. She said that he had also been, at certain moments, quite extraordinarily 12 years old about it, and he considered this and said that was probably fair. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and wasn't quite, and they walked the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who understood each other well enough not to need to fill every space between them with words. The academy gate came into V, the shape of normal. By his 13th year, Ember had grown large enough to cast a shadow over the gate. She waited there each morning and each evening without being asked. The villagers had slowly stopped calling it threatening and started calling it routine. Growth in dragons is not the gradual and polite process it is in most creatures. It happens in surges. Weeks of apparent stillness followed by sudden, undeniable change, as though the body has been quietly accumulating everything it needs and then commits to it all at once. Callum had noticed the first surge in the deep winter, when Ember's head had cleared the fence post she'd previously been level with, and she'd regarded this new perspective with the thoughtful expression of someone reassessing familiar surroundings from an unfamiliar height. By spring, her wingspan, when she stretched it fully in the early mornings, which she did with the unhurried thoroughness of a creature that took its own maintenance seriously, cleared the width of the courtyard, with room to spare on both sides. The academy gate, which had always seemed a permanent and substantial feature of the landscape, now sat squarely within the shadow she cast on clear mornings, and the shadow moved with the sun across the cobblestones in a slow arc that the younger students had begun using, with casual practicality, as a rough measure of the time. This was, Callum reflected, a reasonable indicator of how much things had changed. A year ago, the shadow of a dragon over the academy gate would have emptied the courtyard within minutes. It would have triggered letters and meetings and the particular kind of community anxiety that feeds on itself, growing louder and more certain the less it is interrupted by actual facts. A year ago, Ember's presence anywhere near the school had been treated as an active emergency by people who had never once come close enough to look at her properly. Now, the younger students used her shadow to 4 seconds. One afternoon, she set her chin on Callum's knee for exactly 4 seconds, then pulled away. She stared at the middle distance as though it had absolutely not happened. Callum stared at the middle distance too, so as not to frighten the moment away. It was a Wednesday in late autumn, the kind of afternoon that couldn't decide between melancholy and peace, and had settled into something that contained both equally. The courtyard had emptied after the final bell, the last students dispersing toward warmth and dinner, and Callum had stayed behind the way he sometimes did, not for any particular reason, just because the quiet of the academy after hours had a quality he liked, and because Ember was there, and being where Ember was had become as natural and unconsidered as breathing. he had been reading. A history text, I'd open across his knees, which he had been staring at for 20 minutes without absorbing a single word, because the afternoon light was too pleasant, and his thoughts were elsewhere, and the warmth of Ember beside him was the particular kind of warmth that made concentration feel unnecessary and slightly beside the point. She was settled in her usual position, folded neatly into herself, the way large creatures learn to fold when they have decided a space is theirs. Wings tucked, tail curved, radiating the low, steady heat that had made sitting beside her in the cooling months something Callum had quietly come to depend on. He hadn't been watching her. That was perhaps why it happened. She had always been more willing to be herself when she wasn't being observed. And Callum had learned this early and honored it consistently. The art of being present without watching, of sharing space without making the sharing into something that required acknowledgement or performance. He had become, over the months, very skilled at the particular discipline of noticing things without appearing to notice them, which was its own quiet form of re-speed. The rescue that didn't happen. She once lifted a small child who had tripped on the courtyard steps clean off the ground. She set him back on his feet with great delicacy and looked away immediately after. The child told everyone a dragon had rescued him, and no one corrected a single word. The boy's name was Pip, and he was 6 years old, and he had absolutely no business running on the academy steps during the wet season when the stone was slick and the edges were unforgiving, a fact that the entire faculty had communicated to the entire student body on multiple occasions, and that Pip had apparently filed somewhere he couldn't currently locate. He was running because he was 6, and the bell had rung, and there was something about bells that made 6-year-olds physically incapable of moving at any speed below a sprint. And he hit the slick patch on the 3rd step from the top at full momentum and went down with the kind of totality that belongs exclusively to small children and avalanches. He didn't hit the ground. This was the part that took him a moment to process, because the falling had felt very certain and complete, the kind of fall that had a clear and inevitable conclusion, and then the conclusion simply hadn't arrived. Instead, there was a sensation of being gathered, carefully, firmly, with a precision that was almost surgical. And then he was upright, both feet flat on the dry courtyard stones at the bottom of the steps, his satchel still on his shoulder, his dignity technically intact in the sense that he had not actually contacted the ground at any point. He stood very still for a moment, blinking. You're running an inventory of himself that confirmed he was uninjured and vertical, which was considerably better than the trajectory had suggested. Then he looked up to understand what had happened. Ember was already looking away. She had positioned herself beside the steps that morning the way she sometimes positioned herself in places, not a man who revised himself. Master Fenwick came to Callum privately one autumn and said he may have spoken imprecisely. He had once said dragons were categorically unpredictable, and he wished to revise this. Callum told him it was all right, and Fenwick looked quietly relieved to say no more. Fenwick was not a man who revised things easily. This was not a character flaw so much as an occupational hazard. 31 years of teaching history had built in him a deep and practiced confidence in the authority of established record, in the weight of documented precedent, in the reliability of things that had been written down by people who were considered credible at the time of the writing. He taught from primary sources where possible and secondary sources where necessary, and his own opinion rarely, and when he did offer it, he offered it with the careful precision of someone who understood that a teacher's certainty has a way of becoming a student's fact, whether it deserves to or not. He had said dragons were categorically unpredictable in the hallway during the early days, and he had said it with the full confidence of his 31 years and his 2 historical texts and the general atmosphere of community concern that had made the statement feel not only reasonable but responsible. He had cited his sources. He had used the word categorically, which was a strong word, a word that closed doors rather than opening them, a word that did not leave room for a 12-year-old boy sitting in the mud behind a shed with a bread roll and a willingness to stay. He had been, he now understood, precisely and consequentially wrong. And the autumn that he came to find Callum was the same autumn Pip had told his story about the courtyard steps to anyone who would listen. And the story had done something to Fenwick that facts alone sometimes cannot do. It had made the wrongness of his previous position not just intellectually apparent, but felt, which was a different, Worth never leaving Ember had never been the dangerous one. She had simply been the one waiting in the gap. Waiting to learn whether a kindness offered freely was a real thing that could exist. One Tuesday, a boy sat in the mud and smiled, and she decided he was worth never leaving. This was the truth of it, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. Not a story about a dragon tamed because she had never been tamed. Taming implied the removal of something wild and true, and nothing true had been removed from Ember. She was exactly what she had always been, fully and without apology, in the way that creatures are when they have finally been given sufficient room to be it. Not a story about a boy who was brave, because bravery suggests the overcoming of fear, and Callum had never been particularly afraid of her. He had been curious, and attentive, and possessed of the particular kind of patience that isn't really patience at all, but simply genuine interest in something other than himself. It was, at its core, a story about a gap between a shed wall and a stone fence, and what had been waiting in it, and what had happened when one person had bothered to look. She had been there long enough before he found her to have settled into a kind of terrible equilibrium, not hopeful, not entirely without hope, but suspended in the exhausted middle place between the two where creatures go when they have been hurt enough times to stop expecting anything different and not quite enough times to stop watching the path anyway. She had been watching the path. She had always been watching the path, even when she told herself she wasn't. And even when every reasonable conclusion her experience had built suggested that whatever came down, it would confirm what she already knew. And then Callum had come down it, with his unhurried steps and his coat pockets full of ordinary things and his complete and uncomplicated willingness to sit in the mud on a Tuesday and simply